Welcome to Notebook Summaries. Today, we're diving into the incredible story of the Cayman Islands. How on earth did a tiny, remote group of islands, once famous for little more than sea turtles, become a giant in global finance? Let's get into it.
Well, the answer is this fascinating mix of nature, sheer necessity, and, yeah, a legendary shipwreck. It's a pretty amazing story about resilience, and it shows how a tiny community learned to play the cards they were dealt, turning their isolation into a serious advantage.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll trace this whole evolution through 6 key chapters, from its wild, untamed beginnings all the way to a trial by storm that tested its very foundations. Each piece of this puzzle helps explain how the Caymans became what they are today. Okay, so our story kicks off more than 500 years ago. And really, the island's first names tell you everything you need to know about what people thought was valuable there.
What's so interesting here is how the name just keeps changing, but it always points back to the wildlife. First, they're the Islands of the Turtles, then the Islands of the Alligators, and finally the Islands of the Crocodiles. For centuries, nobody saw the Caymans as a place for people. It was more like a giant floating pantry for passing ships. And this wasn't some small-time hobby. I mean, look at this number, 1,400. That's how many turtles were being caught and sold every single year by the late 1700s. Turtles literally were the economy. But you just can't sustain that forever, right? The islanders were already having to sail farther and farther out to find them. Something had to change.
So who were the first people to actually call this outpost home? See, there was no native population. So the islands started attracting this unique and pretty rugged mix of people, all living on the absolute fringes of the British Empire.
Just try to imagine the kind of society that pops up in a place like this. It was called a total colonial frontier society, which is really just a polite way of saying it was lawless. The very first Caymanians were a mix of army deserters, pirates, shipwrecked sailors, refugees, all these fiercely independent people trying to carve out a life far away from anyone else's rules. And in an environment like that, survival often came down to being clever. Take the art of wrecking, for instance. As you can see, islanders would literally trick ships into crashing. They'd use lanterns on donkeys to look like harbor lights, and once a ship ran aground on the reef, they'd row out for the big rescue of the cargo, that is. Brutal, but hey, it was an effective way to make a living. So, eventually, the British Crown steps in and brings some formal rule to the islands. But the event that would truly forge the Caymanian identity wasn't some political treaty. It was a single, disastrous night at sea.
This event is now known as the Wreck of the 10 Sail, and it could have been a complete and utter catastrophe. We're talking 10 ships, part of a big convoy heading to Britain, all smashed against the reef in the middle of the night. But instead of disaster, something incredible happened. The islanders, the same people who sometimes lured ships onto the reefs, mounted this heroic rescue. They went out into the storm and saved more than 450 lives from the waves.
And this incredible act of heroism gave birth to the foundational myth of the Cayman Islands. The legend goes that a member of the royal family was on one of those ships. And out of gratitude, King George III decreed that Caymanians would forever be free from taxes. Now, it is crucial to note that there's no official record of this decree. It probably didn't happen. But it doesn't matter. The legend became way more powerful than the truth, shaping the island's identity for centuries.
But we have to acknowledge that this era of rugged independence was also built on a much darker foundation. As the islands grew, so did their reliance on enslaved labor. Just looking at the numbers, you can see that by 1802, the enslaved population had actually become the majority on the island. The abolition of slavery in 1835 would, of course, mark a profound and necessary change for Caymanian society. Okay, so for the next 100 years or so, the island's fate was completely tied to their much larger neighbor. From 1863 onwards, the Caymans were basically run as a dependency of Jamaica, a relationship that would eventually lead to a massive decision. It was often a pretty tense relationship. Caymanians felt like they were an afterthought to the administration in Jamaica. So, when Jamaica started pushing for its own independence in 1962, the Caymans had a choice to make: go it alone with Jamaica or chart their own course. Fearing that full independence would cut off their sailors from vital jobs, they made a pivotal decision. They chose to remain a direct territory of the British Crown. And that single choice, it changed everything.
That one decision basically opened the floodgates for a period of explosive growth, transforming the islands from a sleepy little backwater into the modern nation we recognize today. The mid-20th century was just a whirlwind. You can see on this timeline, in 1953, the first airfield and the first bank show up. Boom, the islands are connected to the global economy. By 59, they have their first constitution, but the real game changer came in 1966. New laws, passed with political stability and that tax-free legend in their back pocket, specifically designed to attract international banking. The twin pillars of the modern Cayman economy, finance and tourism, were now set in stone. But in 2004, all of that progress and the nation's legendary resilience were about to face their greatest test, a storm of almost unimaginable power.
Hurricane Ivan was an absolute monster. I mean, try to imagine winds hitting 155 miles per hour with gusts over 200. It was the most powerful storm in the island's recorded history, and it unleashed a 10-foot storm surge that put most of Grand Cayman underwater.
The devastation was almost total. This quote from the leader at the time says it all. 95% of all buildings were damaged. A quarter of them were just gone. The nation that had taken 50 years to build was brought to its knees in a single day.
This chart really puts it into perspective. Only 5% of homes escaped damage. It was a devastating blow. But if this history has taught us anything, it's that the story of the Caymans is about overcoming adversity. And though the recovery was long and incredibly difficult, the islands did rebuild.
And that's really the common thread through this whole history: adaptation. From an economy built on turtles to one built on salvaged cargo, and finally to a global financial hub that could survive even the fury of a storm like Ivan. The Cayman Islands have always found a way to navigate the changing tides.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey, you should definitely explore more in our Quick Country Histories playlist. And of course, be sure to subscribe to Notebook Summaries for more deep dives into fascinating topics.